The rain had not stopped for 3 days, and on the fourth morning it fell harder still, as though the sky itself had decided that Dust Creek, Texas needed to be washed clean of something it could not name. And Maggie Lawson stood at the edge of a freshly turned mound of red clay earth with her hands at her sides, and her black dress soaked through to the skin. And she did not cry, because she had cried every night for a week already, and there was nothing left inside her that knew how to make tears anymore. The year was 1883, and Dust Creek sat on the edge of nowhere in particular, a small cattle town pressed between the dry flatlands of West Texas and the beginning of the hill country, where the soil changed color, and the mesquite trees grew thick, and the wind came off the plains in the evenings with a loneliness that could settle into a person's bones if they let it. The town had a general store, a saloon called the Rusty Nail, a livery stable, a church with a crooked steeple, a doctor's office that doubled as a dentist on Wednesdays, and one small schoolhouse at the far end of Main Street where the teacher, Miss Perkins, kept order with a hickory switch and a stern look that could silence a room of 30 children without a single word. Maggie had lived in Dust Creek for 6 years. She had come there as a bride, young and full of hope, following her husband Thomas Lawson from their hometown of San Antonio, when Thomas had secured a position as the town's deputy sheriff. She had been 22 then, and Thomas had been 26, and they had believed in the future with the particular certainty of people who have not yet been told how difficult the future intended to be. Thomas had been a good man, not a perfect man, but a good one. He drank sparingly, worked hard, kept his word, and loved Maggie with a steady and uncomplicated devotion that she had come to understand was rarer than most women ever admitted. He had been thrown from his horse 3 weeks ago on the road between Dust Creek and the Hendricks Ranch 6 miles east. The horse had shied at a rattlesnake, and Thomas had gone over the animal's head and struck the ground at such an angle that the doctor, a somber and careful man named Dr. Abel Prout, had said the damage to the back of his skull was not something medicine could address. Thomas had lingered for 4 days. Maggie had held his hand through all of them. Now she stood at his grave in the rain, and the minister had already gone, and the small gathering of townspeople who had come to show their respects had retreated under the cover of the church's narrow awning, or had simply walked back toward town with their collars pulled up and their hats low, because the rain was coming sideways now and there was no comfort in standing in it. But Maggie did not move. She did not know how to move. The grave was real, and the mud was real, and the cold water running down the back of her neck was real. And if she walked away from this place, then all of those real things would follow her home and fill every corner of the house she had shared with Thomas, and she was not ready for that yet. She was 28 years old, and she was a widow, and she did not know what that meant for the shape of the rest of her life, and so she simply stood in the rain and let it fall on her because at least it was doing something. At least the sky was expressing something she could not. She did not hear him approach. The mud and the rain conspired to swallow sound, and the man moved quietly by nature, the way men do who have spent years in open country where noise can either save you or get you killed, depending on the situation. She became aware of him only when the rain stopped hitting her face, and the sound of it changed, becoming the sound of rain striking canvas rather than skin, and she looked up, and there above her head was a large black umbrella, held steady and without ceremony by a hand she did not recognize. She turned her head slowly. He was standing perhaps half a step behind her and to her right, holding the umbrella up and over her with his arm extended, so that most of the coverage fell on her rather than on himself, which meant the left side of his broad shoulders was getting wet, and he appeared entirely unconcerned about this. He was a tall man, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that the rain had plastered to the sides of his face, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red limestone that formed the bluffs east of town. He wore a long riding coat, dark brown and trail-worn, and a hat that had been knocked askew by his own umbrella handle. He had brown eyes that were not soft exactly, but that held a quality she could not immediately name, something between careful attention and genuine sorrow, as though he had come to this graveyard not as a stranger intruding on her grief, but as someone who understood grief from the inside. He did not say a word. He simply held the umbrella over her and looked at the grave with those dark eyes, and the rain fell all around them, and Maggie Lawson, who had not cried in 4 days, felt something crack open very quietly in the center of her chest. She did not weep. She simply breathed and looked back at the grave, and stood there in the improbable shelter of a stranger's umbrella, while the storm did everything it had set out to do. They stood there for a long time, long enough that the rain began to ease from a driving downpour to a steady and more civil fall, and the sky over the distant hills showed the first gray lightening of a day that had not yet decided whether it wanted to end or simply continue in this manner indefinitely. And then Maggie said, "Thank you," and her voice came out rough and not quite her own, and the man said, "Yes, ma'am," and nothing more. She looked at him again. "I don't believe I know you." "No, ma'am. I rode in yesterday, Arthur Morgan. I'm looking for work if there's any to be had in this part of the country." His voice was low and even, with something in it that might have been a Virginia origin worn smooth by years of Western travel. It was not an unpleasant voice. It was the kind of voice that said things it meant. "Maggie Lawson," she said, and she watched something move through his expression at the name, a small recognition. "Deputy Lawson's wife," he said, and it was not quite a question. "His widow," she said, and the word hit the air between them like a stone dropping into still water. "I'm sorry," Arthur Morgan said, and the way he said it contained no rehearsed condolence, no social obligation. It sounded like something he actually was. They walked back toward town together, Arthur keeping the umbrella above her the whole way while the rain fell, and the mud road sucked at their boots, and Maggie did not ask him why he had come to the cemetery, or why he had offered the umbrella without speaking first, because in some part of herself that was still working clearly she understood that those were not questions that needed answering. The answer was obvious. He had seen a woman standing alone in the rain at a grave, and he had done what a decent person does. It was, she would think later, the simplest and most extraordinary thing. The town of Dust Creek observed Arthur Morgan's arrival the way small towns always observe strangers, which is to say thoroughly and without apparent shame. By the time he had visited the livery stable to board his horse, a well-built gray named Copperhead, and taken a room at the boarding house run by Mrs. Clara Finch, half the town knew his name, his approximate age, the quality of his saddle, and the fact that he had been seen walking back from the cemetery with Maggie Lawson under one umbrella. Clara Finch, who was 53 years old and had operated her boarding house for 19 years with the organizational efficiency of a military campaign, gave Arthur the room at the end of the hall on the second floor, the one with the window that looked out over the back garden where she grew her herbs and her late-season tomatoes. She charged him a fair rate, gave him clean sheets and a lamp, and warned him that supper was at 6 precisely, and that lateness was not accommodated. Arthur thanked her and meant it. He had slept in worse places than he cared to count. The first morning after the funeral, Maggie woke at her usual hour of 5:30 and lay in the bed she had shared with Thomas for 6 years, and looked at the ceiling, and felt the silence of the house like a physical weight. The house was a small but solid wood-frame structure on the south edge of town, 2 rooms down and 2 rooms up, with a covered porch where Thomas had sat on summer evenings with a glass of sweet tea and his boots off, and his long legs stretched out over the railing. Maggie had always thought that was when he looked most like himself, relaxed and quiet and content. She got up because lying there accomplished nothing. She dressed and made coffee and stood on that same porch in the cool morning air and watched the town begin to move, the livery stable hand crossing the street, the general store owner unlocking his door, the distant sound of the blacksmith's hammer beginning its day. Life continuing. the world indifferent to the particular grief of one 28-year-old woman on the south side of Main Street. The question of what she was going to do was not abstract. It was immediate. Thomas had drawn a deputy's wage, which was not generous but had been sufficient. Without it, Maggie had the house, which was mortgaged, and a small amount of savings, and a set of practical skills she had never thought she would need to convert into income. She could cook. She could sew well enough to do alterations. She could read and write and do figures with accuracy. She had taught herself some rudimentary bookkeeping from a manual Thomas had bought her as a birthday gift 2 years ago, half as a joke, because she had mentioned she found numbers satisfying in the way that puzzles are satisfying. She was thinking about all of this, standing on the porch with her coffee, when she heard boots on the road and looked up and saw Arthur Morgan walking past, his riding coat exchanged for a simpler work jacket, his hat at its natural angle. He was carrying a set of fence tools and appeared to have already secured some manner of employment, which she found both unsurprising and somehow reassuring. He saw her and stopped, touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, Mrs. Lawson." "Good morning, Mr. Morgan." She paused. "You found work quickly. Rancher named Beaumont has a south fence line that needs attention. His foreman put the word out yesterday at the boarding house." He held up the post-hole digger as a sort of evidence. "Not glamorous, but honest." "Most honest work isn't glamorous," Maggie said, and something in the way she said it made him look at her a moment with that careful attention she had noticed the day before. "That's true," he said. "How are you holding up, Mrs. Lawson?" The question was direct enough that it surprised her. Most people in the days since Thomas died had offered condolences in a kind of practiced and slightly distanced way. The way people offer condolences when they are uncertain whether sincere emotion will make things worse. Arthur Morgan asked the question like he actually wanted to know the answer, like he was prepared for whatever answer she gave. "I don't rightly know," she said honestly. "I'm still in the part where everything just seems very quiet." He nodded. "That part takes a while." Something in his tone told her this was not speculation. She looked at him for a moment, this tall, quiet man with the rain-worn coat and the fence tools and the brown eyes that had stood beside her at Thomas's grave without being asked. "Have you lost someone?" she asked, and then immediately said, "Forgive me, that's not my business." "No," he said simply. "My mother some years back, my brother 2 years after that." "Different kinds of loss." He paused. "The quiet you're describing is real. I'm not going to tell you it passes fast because it doesn't, but it does change its character after a while, becomes something you carry different rather than something that just sits on top of you." Maggie looked at her coffee cup. "That's the most useful thing anyone has said to me in a week." Arthur Morgan nearly smiled. It did not quite arrive as a full smile, but the corners of his mouth moved in a way that suggested one might eventually occur. "I should get on. Have a good morning, Mrs. Lawson." "You as well, Mr. Morgan." She watched him walk up the road with the fence tools over his shoulder, and the early morning sun beginning to warm the backs of the buildings on the east side of town, and she thought, for the first time since Thomas died, about something other than the particular shape of her grief. Over the following 2 weeks, Arthur Morgan became a fixture in Dust Creek in the way that certain kinds of people do in small towns, not by being loud or conspicuous, but simply by being present and reliable. Word spread that he was a skilled hand with horses, with fence work, with the general maintenance that every ranch in a 50-mile radius seemed to perpetually require. He did not advertise himself. He simply showed up when work was needed, and did it carefully and without complaint, and asked for fair pay, and moved on to the next task. He ate at the boarding house most evenings and was polite to Clara Finch, who appreciated this. He was quiet at the supper table but not unfriendly, and he listened more than he spoke, which Clara found refreshing in a boarding house that had recently housed 2 traveling salesmen who had talked without stopping for 4 consecutive days. Maggie, in those same 2 weeks, had made decisions. She had gone to see the bank manager, a careful and not unkind man named Harold Yates, who had explained her financial situation with the gentle precision of a doctor delivering news he wished he did not have to deliver. The mortgage on the house had 8 months remaining. Thomas's savings, combined with hers, would cover perhaps 5 of those months if she was careful. There was, Harold suggested, the option of selling the house and taking a smaller situation, perhaps renting a room from someone. Maggie had thanked him and gone home, and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. What she arrived at after considerable thought was this: she would offer her services as a seamstress and laundress, which together could bring in enough to manage. She was also going to ask at the general store whether they needed any part-time help with their books, because she had quietly noticed that Owen McCready, who owned the general store, was a man of magnificent generosity and absolutely no gift for arithmetic, and his accounts were almost certainly a disaster. She was right about the accounts. Owen McCready, who was a large and cheerful red-faced man who genuinely believed he was good with numbers, looked visibly relieved when Maggie proposed spending 3 afternoons a week going through his ledger. He agreed to pay her a modest weekly sum that, combined with the sewing and laundry work, would stretch the mortgage payments far enough that she had real options. It was on the 3rd afternoon of her work at the general store, when she was deep in the accounts ledger, and had discovered that Owen had been charging himself for a shipment of flour that he had already paid for, that the bell over the door rang and Arthur Morgan came in for a spool of heavy thread and a new box of matches. Owen was behind the counter and directed him to the thread, and Arthur found what he needed, and then paused at the counter when he noticed Maggie at the back table with the ledger, and he said, "You're doing his books." And she said, without looking up from her column of numbers, "Someone has to," and Owen McCready laughed and said he couldn't argue with that, and Arthur bought his things and stood at the counter for just a moment longer than necessary, and then he left. It became a small thing, a routine of small acknowledgments. He would pass her house in the mornings and tip his hat. She would see him at the boarding house on the evenings. She visited Clara for supper, which Clara had begun insisting on because she felt that Maggie should not be eating alone every night, and Clara was the kind of woman who expressed concern through the provision of food. They would speak for a few minutes, nothing prolonged, nothing that announced itself as anything particular. He asked about the bookkeeping once, genuinely curious, and she explained the system she had developed for Owen's accounts, and Arthur had listened with full attention and asked a question that demonstrated he had understood everything she said, and Maggie had looked at him over the supper table and thought that there was a significant difference between a man who was polite and a man who was actually listening. On the Thursday of the 3rd week, something happened that shifted the texture of things. Maggie had been working in her back garden, trying to rescue the late-season vegetable beds from the damage the heavy rains had done, when she heard raised voices from the alley that ran behind the properties on the south end of Main Street. She went to the fence and looked through the gap between 2 boards and saw 3 young men she did not recognize, trail hands by the look of them, surrounding a boy of perhaps 12 years old named Samuel Reeves, the son of a local farmer. The trail hands were not being violent exactly, but they were drunk and loud and taking considerable amusement from frightening the boy, who was pressed against the wall of the livery stable with his basket of eggs held tight to his chest, and a look on his face that was trying very hard to be brave. Maggie had the gate open before she had made a conscious decision about it. She walked into the alley with the direct and unhurried manner of a woman who has decided something and said, "Samuel, your mother is looking for you," and the 3 young men turned at the sound of her voice. 2 of them were simply surprised. The third, who was the tallest and appeared to be the most drunk, took a step toward her with an unpleasant expression. "Well now," he started. "I'd stop exactly there," said a new voice, and Arthur Morgan appeared at the other end of the alley, walking with that same quiet, unhurried quality, his hands loose at his sides. He was not wearing a weapon that was visible, but he had the bearing of a man who was entirely unworried about how this situation resolved, which in Maggie's experience was sometimes more effective than a drawn gun. The tall, drunk man looked at Arthur. Arthur looked back at him with the patient expression of someone who has all day and does not particularly care which way this goes. The three trail hands left. Not quickly, because that would have involved admitting something, but they went, scuffing their boots and muttering, and Samuel Reeves let out a very long breath and thanked Mrs. Lawson and looked at Arthur with open admiration. "You all right?" Arthur asked the boy. "Yes, sir," Samuel said. "Thank you." "Go on home," Maggie said gently and watched him go, and then she looked at Arthur. "Good timing," she said. "Heard the noise from the livery," he said. He looked at her with something approaching approval or perhaps amusement. She was not entirely sure which. "You were already handling it. I had a plan. I could tell," the almost smile again. "Your plan involved marching into an alley with three drunk strangers without any sort of weapon. My plan involved being a woman who sounds certain of herself," Maggie said. "Men who are drunk and looking for easy sport tend to be deterred by certainty." Arthur regarded her for a moment. "That's true," he said, "and also brave. Or reckless," she said, "depending on how it went." "Both things can be true," he said. Maggie smiled at that. It was her first real smile in 3 weeks, and it felt strange on her face, like a muscle that had been still for too long. She was aware of it as it happened, and aware that Arthur noticed it, though he did not make any remark about it. "Thank you for the backup," she said, "even if I didn't strictly need it." "Any time," he said. He went back to the livery. Maggie went back to her garden. But something had changed in the air between them. Some small door had opened that had been merely a wall before, and both of them felt it without saying so. It was Clara Finch who said it first, because Clara Finch said everything first, as a matter of personal policy and civic responsibility. She said it to Maggie over supper on a Friday, plainly and without apology, which was how Clara operated. "That man watches over you," Clara said, gesturing toward the window that faced the street as though Arthur were somehow visible through it at that moment. Not in a troubling way, in the way of a man who is paying attention to something he thinks matters. "He's simply a decent person," Maggie said. "Decent people exist in numbers," Clara said. "Men who hold an umbrella over a grieving woman they have never met and stand there in the rain without being asked. Those are rarer. And you know it." Maggie looked at her coffee cup, which she did when she wanted time to think. "It hasn't been 3 months since Thomas died." "I know that," Clara said, not unkindly. "I'm not suggesting you do anything. I'm suggesting you don't pretend not to notice what's in front of you. There's a difference." "He's never said anything." "No," Clara said. "He's the type that wouldn't, at least not yet." She served Maggie another piece of pie with the finality of someone ending a discussion. "Eat. Think about what I said when you're not too tired." Maggie thought about it that night, lying in her bed with the autumn wind moving through the gap under the window. She kept meaning to seal with rags. She thought about Arthur Morgan's brown eyes and his rain-wet shoulders and the way he listened. And the way he had looked at her smile like it was something he was glad to have seen. She thought about Thomas, about the years of steady love and quiet companionship, about the particular shape of the grief she was still carrying, about whether it was betrayal or human nature to notice a man who was alive and kind while her husband was in the ground. She did not arrive at answers. But she stopped pretending she had no questions, which was something. At the beginning of November, a man named Cullen Price rode into Dust Creek and made things complicated. He was a land speculator from Austin, representing a railroad interest that was considering whether the route from San Antonio to the northern cattle markets might profitably run through Dust Creek or bypass it to the east. He was tall, well-dressed by local standards, and had the smooth and practiced manner of a man who had learned early that charm was more efficient than force in most situations. Price took rooms at the boarding house and immediately began conducting business, which meant visiting every significant property owner in town and discussing the question of land values and right-of-way and the various futures available to a small Texas cattle town in 1883, one of which involved becoming a railroad stop, and the other of which involved remaining exactly what it currently was. He framed these futures with the practiced accuracy of a man who knew which one most people would choose. He also, within his first 48 hours in town, became extremely attentive to Maggie Lawson. This was not accidental. Maggie owned, through Thomas's estate, a property that sat directly in the most advantageous path of the proposed rail line. Price was interested in her land. He expressed this interest behind a considerable amount of personal flattery and several invitations to supper at the Rusty Nail's back room, which served food of a quality unusual for a saloon. Maggie was not foolish. She saw the business interest beneath the social attention plainly enough. But Price was not dishonest about it either, exactly, and the offer he eventually made for her property was genuinely significant. More money than she had seen in a lump sum in her life, enough to settle the mortgage and have a remainder that would give her real choices about where to live and how. Arthur Morgan did not like Cullen Price. He said nothing about this for several days, because it was not his business and he knew it, and he was not the kind of man who expressed opinions about other people's choices when those opinions had not been requested. But he watched Price at the boarding-house supper table with the particular stillness of a man keeping something carefully contained, and Clara Finch noticed, and said nothing to him about it either, because Clara was perceptive enough to understand that some conversations needed to find their own timing. The complication arrived on a Thursday evening when Maggie came to the boarding house for supper and Price was there, and seated himself beside her with a proprietary ease that Maggie found slightly irritating but did not publicly correct. And Arthur sat across the table and ate his supper in silence, and when Price said, with his practiced charm, that Mrs. Lawson was a remarkable woman and that Dust Creek was a finer town than he had expected largely on account of her presence, Arthur put down his fork with a quiet exactness that said quite a lot without saying anything. After supper, Maggie was putting on her coat in the hallway when Arthur appeared beside her. Price was in the parlor with a glass of whiskey, talking to another boarder about railroad futures and could not be heard from the hall. "Can I walk you home?" Arthur asked. It was the first time he had asked directly for her company, and the directness of it, the plainness of the request, made something catch in her chest. "Yes," she said, "you can." They walked in the clear, cold November night, their breath making small clouds in the air, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything. The stars over West Texas were extraordinary on cold, clear nights, thick and bright, with the Milky Way spread like a road above the dark, flat plain to the west. "What do you make of Price?" Arthur said, and there was something careful in how he asked it, as though he was aware of the boundary he was approaching. "I make that he wants my land," Maggie said. "He makes no secret of it behind a certain amount of courtesy. The offer he's made is real money, more than the house and land are worth in any ordinary sense." "And the rest of it," Arthur said. The attentiveness. Maggie was quiet for a moment. "That's also real in its way. He's the type of man who genuinely enjoys the company of women he finds interesting. I don't doubt that part. I'm simply not confused about the order of his priorities." Arthur made a small sound that was not quite a word. "You don't like him," Maggie said. "It's not my business," Arthur said. "No," she agreed. "But you don't like him." He was quiet for a few steps. "I don't trust men who move that fast," he said finally. "Not on business, not on anything else. Fast movement in my experience means a man wants to close something before you have a chance to think clearly about it." Maggie looked at him. They had stopped without quite realizing it at the corner where her road turned off from Main Street, and the lamplight from the nearest window fell across one side of his face and left the other in shadow. "That's a useful observation," she said quietly. "You don't need me to tell you this," he said. "You already saw it." "I did," she said. "But it's different when someone else says it. Sometimes it is." He looked at her, and in the lamplight his eyes held something that was not quite contained enough to be called neutral. It was there for just a moment, open and clear, before he put it back where he kept it. "Good night, Mrs. Lawson," he said. "Good night, Mr. Morgan." She walked home. She stood on her porch in the cold air for a long time after she went in, looking at nothing in particular, and felt the night around her and the stars above and the solid ground beneath her boots, and thought about what it meant that the last 3 nights she had fallen asleep thinking not about what she had lost, but about the sound of a particular man's voice saying her name. Maggie made her decision about Price's offer the following week. She declined it, not because the money was insufficient, which it wasn't. She declined it because when she sat down at her kitchen table and laid out the question honestly, as she did with Owen McCready's accounts, treating the facts as facts and the feelings as separate but real, she understood that selling the property meant leaving Dust Creek. Price's railroad interest would build a depot and a workyard on the land, and the character of the immediate neighborhood would change in ways that were not compatible with the residential property that remained. She would, in practical terms, need to go elsewhere, and she found when she was honest about it that she did not want to go elsewhere. She had a growing work situation here. She had Clara, who had become something between an employer and an aunt and a mother, depending on the day. She had the town, which she knew, and the landscape, which she had learned to love in the way you can only love land you have lived in long enough to understand it. She told Price on Wednesday morning, calmly and directly, that she would not be selling. He was gracious about it in the surface sense, the way men are gracious when they want to leave a door open for future negotiations. He would be leaving town by the end of the week either way, since his preliminary survey work was done, and the railroad would make its route determination in the new year regardless of her property. He left on Saturday. Maggie stood on her porch and watched his rented carriage go north toward the road and felt a kind of spaciousness return to the air that she had not realized had been missing. Arthur Morgan, who had seen the carriage from the livery yard where he was working, allowed himself one small private release of held breath and went back to what he was doing. In the second week of November, something happened between Arthur and Maggie that was so simple it almost seemed like nothing, and then became the thing that changed everything. He had been working a week on the Beaumont Ranch fence line and had come back into town on a Wednesday afternoon, and he stopped at the general store for supplies and found Maggie there at her back table with the ledger. And Owen McCready was not present because Owen had gone to the dentist, which happened every few months, and which Owen described as one of the great miseries of his life. Maggie was alone in the store, minding it while she worked. A customer came in for nails and rope. Maggie helped him without disrupting her accounting. Another came for sugar and coffee beans, and she weighed and wrapped them with the efficient movements of someone who has done this often. Arthur bought his supplies and then, rather than leaving, he leaned against the counter with his purchases in hand and said, "How's the ledger?" "Improving," she said, without looking up. Owen sold 4 saddles in October and forgot to record 2 of them. He also overordered lamp oil by approximately 30 gallons because he got the storage capacity of the back room confused with the actual demand figures for the quarter. None of this is a crisis, but it explains why his profit last month looked worse than it should have. "Do you like this work?" Arthur asked. "The numbers work." She did look up then. "I do, honestly. There's a satisfaction in it. A thing that was disordered becomes ordered. A confusion becomes clear. I find that satisfying in a way I can't fully explain." "You don't need to explain it," he said. "I understand that feeling. Just about tools and land instead of numbers." "Tell me about that," she said, and then caught herself, because it was the kind of thing you say to someone you are comfortable with, not to someone you are maintaining a careful and appropriate distance from, and she was not entirely sure when she had stopped maintaining that distance without noticing. But Arthur answered without hesitation. "When something's broken and you fix it properly, not just makeshift but actually right, there's a moment when you know it's going to hold. When the joint is true and the post is plumb and the thing will stand for 20 years if left alone. That's a clean feeling. I like clean feelings." Maggie looked at him for a long moment. "How long have you been doing ranch work?" "Going on 12 years, he said. "I started young, after my mother died." My father was not a reliable man, and I found that being useful somewhere other than home was the most practical thing I could do with myself. Where was home? Virginia, originally, then Kansas for some years. Then I followed the cattle routes west and never quite had a reason to stop anywhere until now. The words settled. Neither of them remarked on what they meant. Have you ever wanted land of your own? Maggie asked. Many times, he said. I've never had the money together at the same time I had the opportunity. The two things seem to avoid each other on purpose. I understand that, she said, and she meant it. And she thought about the mortgage and the accounts and the shape of a future that was still being decided. And she thought about this man leaning against the counter with his supplies in hand talking about clean feelings and plumb posts. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her in its directness, that she very much wanted him to stay in Dust Creek. Arthur, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. He looked at her steadily. I think you should stay, she said, in Dust Creek if you're looking for somewhere. I've been thinking about it, he said quietly, if there's reason enough to. They looked at each other across the general store counter for a moment that lasted a very particular and singular length of time, and then a customer came in for candle wax and Maggie turned to help them. And when she looked back, Arthur was folding his receipt into his coat pocket and smiling, properly this time, the full arrival of the expression she had been waiting weeks to see. It was a good smile. It changed the whole composition of his face. I'll see you at supper, he said. You will, she said. He left. She turned back to the ledger and stared at the column of numbers for a full minute without writing anything at all, which was unprecedented. In late November, the sheriff of Dust Creek, a large taciturn man named Sheriff Walt Briggs, came to Arthur with a proposal. Briggs was 57 years old and had been the law in Dust Creek for 14 years, and had decided that 14 years was enough for one man's back and knees and general constitution. He was looking for a deputy. He had been looking since Thomas Lawson died, though he had not rushed it because rushing it felt wrong. He had observed Arthur Morgan for 6 weeks now, and he had asked quiet questions of the people Arthur had worked for, and he had liked what he heard. He caught Arthur at the livery yard on a Tuesday and made his proposal plainly. The job was Thomas's old job. Deputy sheriff, town law, some patrol work on the surrounding roads, steady wage, quarters available in the jail building if needed. Arthur listened without interrupting. When Briggs finished, Arthur said, "Give me until Friday to answer." On Friday, he said yes. Maggie heard about this secondhand from Clara, who heard about it from Harold Yates at the bank, who had heard it from Briggs himself. She was sitting at her kitchen table having her morning coffee when Clara arrived with this news and the expression of a woman who has confirmed something she had suspected for some time. "Well," Maggie said. "Indeed," said Clara. "He's taking Thomas's job," Maggie said, and the complicated nature of this was evident in her voice. "Different man," Clara said gently. "Different reasons. Same town that needs someone to look after it." Maggie nodded slowly. "I know, it's just strange." "Many things are strange," Clara said. "That's not a reason for them not to be right." Arthur came to see her that evening, which she had expected. He knocked on her front door with his hat in his hand, which she had not expected because it was such a deliberate gesture, such a conscious statement of respect. "I wanted to tell you myself," he said when she opened the door, "about the deputy position, before you heard it elsewhere. I know it's not a simple thing. Given Thomas," she said. "Yes." "Come in," she said, and stood back from the door, and he came in and she made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table across from each other in the lamplight with the November wind pressing on the windows, and she said, "Tell me why you said yes." "Because this town needs someone to do it and I can do it well," he said. "Because I'm staying, and if I'm staying I should be useful to the place I'm staying in. And because Briggs is a good man who deserves to retire without leaving something undone." He paused. "And because Thomas Lawson was a good man who held that job with honor from what I've heard, and it feels important to do it the same way." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "He was," she said. "He was a very good man." "I know," Arthur said. "I could tell from the way this town talks about him. the way you talk about him when you do." "I loved him," she said, and her voice was steady. "He was my husband and I loved him, and I'm going to carry that for the rest of my life." She looked at Arthur across the table. "That's the truth of it." "I know it is," Arthur said. "I'm not asking you to carry it differently." The words settled between them, and Maggie felt something that she could only describe afterward as a kind of settling in herself, like a joint going true, a post going plumb. He was not asking her to replace Thomas or forget him or put him away somewhere more convenient. He was simply here in his own right, asking for nothing except what she chose to give. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me yourself." "Of course," he said. He finished his coffee and stood, and she stood too, and they were close in the small kitchen with the lamplight making everything warm. And Arthur looked at her with those dark eyes that held their careful and genuine attention, and he said, "Maggie, I'd like to court you if you'll allow it, slowly and properly and without hurry. I understand what you've come through and I'm not trying to move past it. I just want to be honest with you about where I stand." It was the most words he had said to her at one time since the rain. She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "I'll allow it." He put his hat on and walked to the door, and there he stopped and turned back and said, with that almost smile that had now fully arrived as an actual smile, "Good night, Mrs. Lawson." "Maggie," she said, "if you're going to court me, you should probably use my name." "Good night, Maggie," he said, and the way he said it made the name sound like something he had been holding carefully for a while, and was glad to finally set down in the open air. December came in cold and clear and beautiful, the way the Texas hill country edge can be in December when the rains have finished, and the sky goes to an impossible blue, and the light falls long and golden across the dry grass and the limestone bluffs. Maggie learned, over the slow and careful weeks that followed Arthur's honest declaration, that courtship in the year 1883 in a small West Texas town was conducted under the watchful and generally approving gaze of approximately 400 people, all of whom had opinions. Clara Finch's opinion was positive, and she expressed it daily. Owen McCready, who had become fond of Maggie in the way of a man who has watched someone organize his accounts and feels profound personal gratitude, expressed his approval by giving Arthur a slightly reduced price on tobacco and nodding meaningfully whenever the deputy came into the store. The minister, Reverend Gaines, a small, careful man of about 60 who genuinely liked both people involved, said nothing but smiled at Maggie every Sunday with a warmth that communicated everything clearly. There were, of course, some people who said it was too soon, which was inevitable and which Maggie had expected, and which she accepted with an equanimity that surprised even herself. She was not moving fast. Nobody was. Their courtship moved at the pace of two people who had both learned that hurry was not always wisdom. They had supper together at Clara's on Thursdays. On Sunday afternoons they walked, which was the accepted social form of courtship in 1883, and they walked through the town and out along the road that went east toward the bluffs, and they talked about everything with a thoroughness that Maggie found both satisfying and astonishing. She had not known how much she had to say until she had someone to say it to who would listen all the way to the end of a thought, and then respond to what she had actually said rather than what he had expected her to say. She told him about growing up in San Antonio, in a household where her father worked the packing trade, and her mother kept 4 children and a vegetable garden and an exacting standard of conduct. She told him about learning figures from a school teacher who believed, unusually for the time and place, that girls had as much use for mathematics as boys did. She told him about meeting Thomas at a dance, about the particular color of the sky on the evening he proposed, about the quality of hope she had felt driving north to Dust Creek 6 years ago with their things in a wagon and the whole of the future spread out ahead of them. Arthur told her about Virginia, about a childhood that had its difficult parts, about his father's drinking and the particular exhaustion of being the older brother in a house where the adults were not reliable. He told her about leaving at 16 with not much more than a horse and a determination to find work, about the years of cattle drives and ranch work, and the long, slow education of the open country. He told her about his brother James, who had died of fever in Kansas at 21 years old, and about the particular shape of that grief, how it came back in the evening sometimes without warning. He was not a man given to elaborate self-expression. But the things he said completely and without performance, and Maggie found that she trusted him in a very specific and uncomplicated way that had nothing to do with time or convention, and everything to do with the fact that she had never once caught him being a different person, depending on who was watching. On the third Sunday in December, they had walked out to the bluffs east of town and were sitting on the limestone edge, watching the last of the daylight go out of the sky to the west, the whole of the plain turning that particular deep amber that preceded the cold blue of dusk, and Maggie was thinking about something she wanted to say, and trying to find the right way to say it, and then deciding, in the manner she had adopted with herself, that finding the right way was less important than saying the true thing. "I'm happy," she said. "Right now in this moment, I'm happy, and I want you to know that because I think you might not know it and I think you should." Arthur looked at her. The light was going amber and it was on both their faces, and the wind off the plain was cold but not unpleasant. "That means more to me than I know how to say," he said quietly. "You don't have to say it," she said. "I can see it." She smiled at him. "You look like a man who just found out the joint is true." He laughed then, a real laugh, low and warm, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh fully, and the sound of it went into her chest and stayed there. "That's exactly what I look like," he said. She reached out and put her hand on top of his where it rested on the limestone, and he turned his hand over and held hers, carefully, the way you hold something you are aware of the value of, and they sat there on the bluff edge with the stars beginning to appear, and the plain going dark, and the lights of Dust Creek warm and yellow in the middle distance, and neither of them said anything more for a long while, because nothing more needed to be said. Christmas came and went, and Maggie and Clara and Arthur had Christmas dinner together with a number of other people who had nowhere particular to be, and it was warm and loud and full of food, and Arthur helped Clara's neighbor Mr. Whitfield carry in extra chairs from the barn, and afterward sat on the porch with Mr. Whitfield and two other men from the boarding house, and a pot of coffee, and they talked about the cattle market and the railroad question and the winter range conditions, and Maggie watched them from the window with her hand around a warm cup and felt the season around her, and thought that there was a kindness in the world that she had almost stopped believing in. The new year arrived, 1884. In January, Sheriff Briggs retired formally, and Arthur Morgan was confirmed as the acting sheriff of Dust Creek, because Briggs had put him in for the position directly, and the town council, after a brief and not very contentious discussion, agreed. It was not the most glamorous promotion in the history of Texas law enforcement. It was a small town with a small badge and a modest wage. But it was something he had earned, and the town knew it, and he wore the badge with the same quiet precision he brought to everything else. The mortgage on Maggie's house came due in February. She had, through the bookkeeping work and the sewing and the laundry and 3 months of very careful management, gotten within a manageable distance of meeting it. Harold Yates at the bank extended the deadline by 30 days, which was both kind and within his authority, and Maggie met the payment on the 28th day of that extension with approximately $15 to spare, which she deposited immediately, and then walked home and stood in her kitchen and put her hands flat on the table and took a long breath. She owned her house. The land was hers. The future, which had looked so frighteningly uncertain 4 months ago, had resolved into something that could be lived in. She told Arthur that evening when he came for supper. He had taken to coming for supper on Tuesdays and Thursdays at her house, and she had taken to cooking more than she strictly needed for one person on those nights, which was a practical acknowledgment of what they both already knew. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and listened to the mortgage news and said, with a directness and warmth that was entirely characteristic of him. "I'm proud of you." "It wasn't remarkable," she said. "It was arithmetic. It was 4 months of work and resolve and arithmetic," he said. "That's remarkable." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The lamplight was warm and the stew was good and the winter wind was outside where it belonged and the kitchen was the most comfortable place Maggie could remember being in a very long time. "Arthur," she said. "Yes. I love you," she said. I wanted to say that plainly without preamble. He was still for a moment in the way of a man absorbing something he had hoped for but not allowed himself to assume. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. "I love you," he said. "I have for some time. I was waiting until you were ready to hear it." "I've been ready for a while," she said. "I was waiting until I was sure it was fair to say it." "Is it fair now?" he asked, and there was a gentleness in the question that she felt in her whole chest. "Yes," she said. "It's fair now." He got up from his chair and came around the table, and he stood before her, and she stood too. And he put his hands on either side of her face with the same careful precision he brought to every physical thing. And he kissed her, and it was tender and steady and entirely certain, the way he was in everything. And Maggie put her hands on the front of his coat, and held on and felt the warmth of it go all the way through her to the cold thing she had been carrying since Thomas died and begin, gently and without force, to change the nature of it. He stayed for supper. He stayed until the lamp needed refilling. Then he put on his hat and his coat and stood at her front door and held her hands in his and looked at her with those dark eyes that were warm now, open in a way she had not seen them in any other context. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said. "You will," she said. He walked up the road under the winter stars, and Maggie stood at her door and watched him go and thought that the world was a very strange and very generous thing sometimes. March came, and with it the beginning of spring on the West Texas plain, the grass going green along the creek beds and the wildflowers beginning their annual declaration in the fields beyond town. And Arthur Morgan came to supper on a Thursday in the second week of March with a different quality about him. Not nervous exactly. Arthur was not easily nervous, but alert to himself in a way she noticed. He waited until after supper, until the table was cleared and the coffee made, and then he reached into his coat pocket and put a ring on the table between them. It was a simple band, silver, with a small inset turquoise stone that was the color of the Texas sky in October. He had ordered it from a jeweler in San Antonio through the mail, and it had arrived that week, and he had spent 2 days deciding when to do this. "Maggie," he said, "I want to marry you. I want to build a life here in this town with you. I want to be a proper home for you, and I want to grow things with you, whatever that means over the years. I'm not offering you perfection because I don't have that. I'm offering you everything I do have, which is considerable, I think, if you want it." Maggie looked at the ring and then at him, and she felt the full weight of the moment, the way it sat between the past and the future and contained both. Thomas, whom she had loved and buried. This man whom she loved and who was alive and here and hers if she said yes. The grief she carried and the joy she had found and the way both could be true at once. "Yes," she said, "I want it. I want all of it." She picked up the ring and put it on and held her hand out in the lamplight, and they both looked at it for a moment. And then Arthur was holding her and she was holding him, and the kitchen was warm and the spring night was cool outside the windows, and the ring was on her finger, and it was solid and real and right. They married in June, on a Saturday morning, with the whole of Dust Creek's population invited, and most of them attending, because a wedding is a shared public act in a small town, and everyone had watched this particular story unfold with the investment of people who have been following a serial for months and are satisfied with the conclusion. Clara Finch made a cake of formidable size and decoration. Owen McCready closed the general store for the morning and attended in a suit that had not seen the light of day since his own wedding 11 years ago. Reverend Gaines, who performed the ceremony under the great oak at the side of the church, had never officiated with more evident pleasure. Maggie wore a dress of deep blue cotton, made by her own hands, with ivory lace at the collar and cuffs, and she carried wildflowers she had picked herself that morning from the field east of town. And she stood under the oak with the June sun warm on her face, and looked at Arthur Morgan, and thought about the rain and the umbrella and the grave and the long strange road between that morning and this one. He stood before her in a clean dark suit that Clara Finch had pressed into submission, and he held her hands and said his vows in that low, even voice that she had come to love precisely, and his eyes were on her face with that full, undivided attention, and she thought that she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for the rain. Reverend Gaines pronounced them married, and a sound went up from the assembled town, laughter and calling, and the particular joyful noise of a community that has invested itself in a story, and is glad it ended well. Arthur kissed her there under the oak with the whole of Dust Creek watching, which was not his preferred manner of doing things, but for Maggie he made the exception without hesitation. The summer was the best summer Maggie could remember. The days were long and warm, and the evenings were cool on the porch, and Arthur had a habit of sitting with his boots off and his feet on the porch rail in the evenings that made something catch in Maggie's throat the first time. She saw it because it was so like Thomas and so different at the same time, and she understood in that moment that the heart is capable of more than one love in a lifetime without diminishing either one. She told Arthur about it. She told him everything because they had established between themselves from the beginning that this was how they operated, and he listened and said that he thought Thomas would have approved of her finding her way to happiness, and that if he wouldn't have, then Thomas would have been the kind of man who didn't deserve her, and Maggie looked at him and said, he would have approved, and Arthur nodded and said, good, and that was the end of it. Arthur was good at the job of sheriff. He was firm without being harsh, consistent without being rigid, and had the quality of command that comes not from loudness, but from a genuine and unperformed confidence in his own judgment. The town settled around his presence in the way that towns do when they feel looked after. Disputes were resolved. The occasional difficulty with trail hands passing through was managed with minimum drama. Dust Creek began to have a reputation on the road as a town where the law was fair and troubles were not welcome, which reduced the troubles considerably. Maggie kept her bookkeeping work with Owen McCready and expanded it. She took on 3 other businesses in town over the course of the year: the doctor's practice, the livery stable's accounts, and the small dry goods concern that opened in the spring of 1885, run by a recent arrival named Martin Chalk. She was, by any accounting, a woman of independent professional standing, which was not common, and which the town accepted because she was Maggie Morgan now, and nobody in Dust Creek was going to argue with Arthur Morgan's wife about the proper sphere of women's activities. In the spring of 1885, Maggie discovered she was expecting a child. She told Arthur on a Thursday evening, on the porch, in the long golden light of an April sunset, and his face did something she had never seen it do before, which was to open completely, with nothing held back at all, and she understood in that moment that he had wanted this perhaps more than he had let himself know. He put his arms around her carefully, the way he held everything he was aware of the value of. "A family," he said, and his voice was not quite steady. "A family," she confirmed. The baby was born in November of 1885, a boy, which was not surprising given that Arthur Morgan's family seemed to run to boys. They named him Thomas James Morgan, Thomas for the man who had been part of Maggie's story and deserved to be remembered, James for Arthur's brother who had died too young. It was the right thing to name him, and both of them knew it, without having to discuss it at length. Thomas James was a solid and cheerful baby who took after Arthur in coloring and Maggie in disposition, which Clara Finch declared the ideal combination with the authority of someone who felt entitled to an opinion about this. He was passed around the boarding-house supper table on his first public outing, and admired comprehensively by everyone present, and Arthur sat at the head of the table with the particular pride of a man who has arrived somewhere he had not quite believed he would reach. Clara Finch herself was Thomas James's unofficial grandmother, a role she occupied with enthusiasm and no small amount of spoiling, which Maggie addressed occasionally and without particular success. The winter of 1885 was a good one. The house was warm, the books balanced. Thomas James slept in his cradle by the kitchen fire with his small fists up by his face, and Maggie and Arthur moved through the days in the comfortable and companionable way of people who have built something real between them and know it. Maggie's bookkeeping practice had grown to the point where she was effectively the informal financial officer of Dust Creek's commercial life, which was a development that Owen Macready had found satisfying in the specific way of a man who had predicted something before it happened and was now watching it come true. She had hired a part-time assistant, a young woman named Eliza Crane, who had arrived in Dust Creek from Abilene with her mother, and a talent for figures that Maggie had identified within 2 conversations. Hiring Eliza was not just a practical decision. Maggie was aware that she was doing for Eliza something of what the practical San Antonio schoolteacher had done for her, which was treating a woman's intelligence as a working asset rather than a social inconvenience. She took the responsibility of that seriously. Arthur knew about it and approved and said so, and Maggie looked at him over the breakfast table when he said it, and thought that she had been right, back in the rain, to accept the shelter of that umbrella, to turn and look at the stranger who offered it without asking, to let him slowly into the edges and then the center of her life. The spring of 1886 brought changes to Dust Creek. The railroad question had resolved itself, not in the direction of the town, but of the route 15 miles to the east, which meant that Dust Creek would not become a railroad town, but would not be disrupted by becoming one either. The town remained itself, which suited most of its residents, and trade adjusted to the new reality with the practical adaptability of Western frontier communities who had learned that circumstances changed, and you changed with them. Eliza Crane had taken on the Macready account solo in the spring and handled them without difficulty. Maggie was proud of her in the straightforward manner of a teacher whose student no longer needs the teacher, which she considered the highest form of professional success. Arthur's reputation had grown beyond Dust Creek. The county sheriff had come to him twice with questions about law enforcement approach, which was a form of professional recognition that Arthur received with his characteristic quietness and mild embarrassment. He was offered a deputy position in a larger county seat once, and declined it without significant deliberation. "This is where we live," he told the county sheriff, with the simple finality of a man who has decided something and has no need to explain it further. That summer, Maggie found she was expecting again. Arthur's face went through the same complete openness as before, with an added element that she thought was something like amazed gratitude. The second child was born in February of 1887, a girl, which Maggie had known somehow before the birth with a certainty she could not explain, and which proved accurate. They named her Alina Ruth Morgan, Alina being Maggie's mother's name, and Ruth being the name of a graytan of Arthur's who had been, by his account, the kindest person in a family that was not always known for kindness. Alina Ruth was a different creature from her brother entirely. Where Thomas James was equable and cheerful and patient, Alina Ruth arrived into the world with opinions and communicated them at volume from the first morning. Arthur held her on the second day and looked down at this small, furious girl with an expression of absolute helplessness that Maggie found the most endearing thing she had ever seen on a grown man's face. "She has your determination," he said. "I'll take that as a compliment," Maggie said from her bed, where she was recovering in the precise manner of a woman who intends to be back on her feet in a reasonable number of days regardless of anyone's opinion. "It was one," he said. Thomas James was 16 months old and deeply fascinated by his sister, which manifested in a habit of appearing at the cradle edge and staring at her with the concentrated attention of a scientist examining a new specimen. He was also protective of her from the first week, which Arthur observed with the quiet pleasure of a father watching a person become themselves. Clara Finch came every afternoon in Alina's first month, and sat in the kitchen with Maggie and drank coffee and talked, which was as much practical help as the food she brought, and the laundry she occasionally spirited away and returned clean without being asked. She was, at 59, still managing her boarding house with full efficiency, though she had hired help now in the form of a reliable local woman named Annette. Life in Dust Creek in the late 1880s was the life of a frontier community finding its permanent shape. The lawlessness of the earlier decades had not vanished entirely, but it had receded as the land filled in with people who intended to stay, who had built things and planted things and buried things, and had reasons that were rooted to particular places. Arthur Morgan's steadiness as sheriff was part of this. The town trusted him and he trusted the town, and the relationship was, in its quiet way, a good example of what civil order was supposed to look like. There were difficulties, as there always are. A drought summer in 1887 that dried the creek beds and made the cattle ranches north of town anxious. A brief outbreak of fever in 1888 that Dr. Prout managed with his characteristic careful precision, and which lost the town 2 elderly residents before it ran its course. A dispute over water rights between 2 neighboring ranchers that threatened violence, and was resolved through Arthur's mediation over 3 long Saturdays and 2 shared bottles of whiskey. There was also, in 1888, a situation that tested things in a more personal way. A man came to town looking for work, and turned out to be someone Arthur had a complicated history with, a man named Coles from the Kansas years who had a grievance he considered unresolved, and a temper he had never managed to educate. Arthur handled it with transparency, telling Maggie about the history directly and without softening, and telling Coles directly that whatever the history was, this town was not the place for it, and Coles, after a few days of unpleasant posturing, left. Maggie asked Arthur after Coles had gone whether there would be more of that. Arthur looked at her steadily and said there might be, that a man who had spent years in rough country accumulated history whether he wanted to or not, and that he would always tell her the truth of it and let her decide what she felt. "I already know what I feel," Maggie said. "I'm not going anywhere." He held her face in his hands and looked at her with everything open and said, "I know. I just want you to always have the choice." "I'm choosing," she said, "every day." That was 1888, and by then they had been married 4 years, and Maggie Morgan wore her life like a well-fitted coat. Not easy exactly, because nothing worth having is easy, but right in the specific way of something that has been made for the particular person wearing it. Thomas James was 3 years old, and had his father's dark eyes and his mother's gift for observation, which he deployed with a focused intensity that made adults feel slightly evaluated when they came to the house. Alina Ruth was a year and a half and had her mother's eyes and her own particular character, which was loud and certain and absolutely undeterred by obstacles, a quality that she demonstrated continuously by attempting to climb every piece of furniture in the house before she could properly walk. Arthur had built an addition to the house the summer after Alina was born, adding a 3rd room upstairs and extending the porch to wrap around the south side where the afternoon light was best. He had done most of the work himself on weekends and in the early mornings before his sheriff's duties began, and Maggie had watched him from the kitchen window during those early mornings, working in the gray pre-dawn light with that precise and careful quality, and had thought about the first conversation they'd had about plumb posts and clean feelings. The house was true now. He had built it true. In 1889, Dust Creek incorporated as a proper municipality, which meant a mayor and a town council, and a more formal structure for the sheriff's office. And Arthur Morgan was voted the first official sheriff of the incorporated town of Dust Creek by a margin that indicated essentially no opposition. He accepted the position with the same quietness with which he accepted everything, shook the mayor's hand, and went back to work. The years between 1889 and 1893 were the years of the town settling into itself, and Maggie and Arthur settled with it. Thomas James grew from a quiet, observant toddler into a quiet, observant boy of 8 who had his father's competence with physical things and his mother's love of figures, which was an unusual combination that his teacher, the now-aged Miss Perkins, found both delightful and occasionally challenging, because Thomas James applied mathematical analysis to situations that did not always benefit from it. Eleanor Ruth, at 6, was a force of personality that the household organized around with the pragmatic adaptation of people who understand that some personalities are simply larger than the space they occupy. She had decided, at some point in her 5th year, that she wanted to be a doctor, a decision prompted by watching Dr. Prout treat her brother's broken finger with calm and methodical skill. This declaration had been met by Maggie with full seriousness, and by Arthur with careful consideration and no dismissal, and by Dr. Prout himself with the reserved pleasure of someone who recognizes a genuine vocation when it announces itself, even if it's announcing itself from a 6-year-old girl in a striped pinafore. In the spring of 1893, on a warm May evening when the wildflowers were thick in the field east of town, and the sky was doing the long, slow spectacle of a Texas sunset, Maggie and Arthur sat on the south porch with their coffee and the sounds of their children inside the house, Thomas James reading aloud to Eleanor from a story book he had finished but she had not, and the domesticity of it settled around Maggie like something she had almost not let herself have. "Do you remember," she said, "the rain?" Arthur looked at her. "I remember everything about that day," he said. "I didn't hear you coming," she said. "And then the rain stopped on my face. That was the first thing I knew of you." "I didn't plan it," he said. "I was coming in from the road, saw the gathering at the church, heard someone had been buried. I had the umbrella because I'd bought it from the general store the day I arrived, expecting the weather to hold and being wrong about it." He paused. "And then I saw you standing there, and I went." "Without a word," she said. "What would I have said?" He turned to look at her. "You didn't need words. You needed to be out of the rain." "I needed someone to be there," Maggie said. "That's what I needed, someone to just be there without requiring anything of me." "I know," he said quietly. She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that as the sun went down, and the sky turned colors over the western plain, amber and rose and deep violet, and the children's voices inside the house were warm and continuous, and the smell of the supper Maggie had made earlier still hung in the air of the porch, and Arthur's arm was solid around her, and the porch boards were steady under their feet, built level and true by his hands. And the night was coming on with all its stars. In 1894, a 3rd child arrived. Another boy, born in September and named for nobody famous, simply called William Arthur Morgan. William because Maggie had always liked the name, and Arthur because she insisted. And Arthur had said the child had his name and needed no second copy of it, and Maggie had said that was precisely the point. And the argument had lasted 10 minutes and ended in laughter, which was how their arguments generally ended. William Arthur was a cheerful and uncomplicated baby who slept well and ate well, and regarded the world with a round-eyed openness that suggested either a fundamentally untroubled nature or a temporary phase he would grow out of. Thomas James, now 9, took his role as eldest with solemnity. Eleanor Ruth, now 7, treated her new brother as an interesting project and would have conducted unsanctioned medical experiments on him had not Maggie maintained vigilance. The Morgan household was full and warm and occasionally chaotic in the way of households with 3 children at varying stages of self-determination, and Arthur moved through it with the same steadiness with which he moved through everything, a fixed point around which the activity of the house organized itself. He was not an effusive father, but he was a constant one, present and attentive and genuinely interested in the people his children were becoming, and Maggie had noticed, years ago, that the children went to him with the kind of comfortable certainty that indicated they had never once doubted they were wanted. Thomas James came to him with questions about the land and the cattle trade and the logic of the water rights disputes Arthur dealt with in his professional life. Alina Ruth came to him with medical questions, having secured a basic anatomy text from Dr. Prout in an arrangement of impressive negotiating skill for a 9-year-old. William Arthur, when he was old enough to have questions, came mostly to ask about the horse, which he had identified as the most interesting thing in the family's possession. Maggie's bookkeeping practice had grown into something that was genuinely a business of its own by the mid-1890s. She had 3 regular assistants now, all women, all trained by her in the methods she had developed over 12 years of practice, and she had written out those methods in a manual of sorts, a bound notebook of clear instruction that Dr. Prout had looked over and called impressive, and which had been requested by a firm in San Antonio that taught commercial skills. She was, in the language of the time and place, a businesswoman, and this was known and respected in Dust Creek and in the surrounding country, and she was aware that this was partly because of Arthur's standing and partly in spite of the conventions of 1895, and partly because she had simply made herself too useful to categorize away, and she accepted all 3 causes with the equanimity she had developed for complicated truths. The spring of 1896 brought a letter that mattered. It came from a law school in San Antonio, responding to a letter Maggie had written on behalf of the general principle of women's education and economic participation, and the response was neither encouraging nor dismissing, but was thoughtful, and she kept it in the box where she kept important documents. Alongside Thomas Lawson's deputy badge and the first bookkeeping manual she had ever used, and a pressed wildflower from her own wedding bouquet that had retained a ghost of its color through 14 years. Arthur read the letter when she showed it to him and said, "You should keep writing them," and she said, "I intend to." And they both understood that some things moved slowly but moved, and that the direction of movement mattered more than the speed. Sheriff Walt Briggs died in the spring of 1897 at 61 years old, peacefully in his bed, having lived long enough to see the retirement he had wanted, and to observe the town he had protected for so long in the competent hands of his successor. His funeral was attended by the whole of Dust Creek, and conducted by a now elderly Reverend Gaines with the same calm warmth that had always characterized him. Arthur stood at the graveside with his hat in his hand, and felt the familiar weight of loss with the familiarity of someone who has carried it before, and Maggie stood beside him and held his hand, and the spring rain, which was light and fine, fell on both of them together, and neither of them stood apart in it. Clara Finch sold the boarding house in 1898 to a young couple from Dallas, and moved into the small house next to Maggie and Arthur's that had come available when the previous occupant relocated north. This was largely Maggie's doing, having identified the house and brought it to Clara's attention with a casualness that fooled nobody. Clara settled into the neighboring house with her furniture and her herb garden and her opinions, and became in practical terms the nearest thing to a grandmother that Thomas James and Alina Ruth and William Arthur had in Dust Creek, their actual grandparents being either deceased or distant. She was, by 1899, 68 years old and somewhat slower in her movements, but entirely undimmed in her capacity for observation and expression, and she held the moral center of the Morgan household in her small, fierce hands with the authority of tenure. On a Sunday morning in September of 1899, Maggie and Arthur walked to the church together, which they did every Sunday, with the 3 children arranged around them, Thomas James at 15 with his father's height already coming in, Alina Ruth at 12 with her mother's precise blue eyes, and a copy of Gray's Anatomy she had borrowed from Dr. Prout hidden under her church dress, and William Arthur at 4 in his good boots, walking with the deliberate gravity of a child who has been told, "These are his good boots," and is taking this seriously. After the service, they walked home through the town, past the general store that Owen McCready now ran with his eldest son, past the livery stable where Arthur's gray copperhead had long since been replaced by a younger horse also named for his coloring, past the school where Miss Perkins had been replaced by a newer and somewhat less severe teacher named Mr. Holland, past the places where Dust Creek's small history had made itself. They came home to the house with its wraparound porch, and Clara was already on her own porch next door with her coffee, and William Arthur broke from the group and ran to her because Clara always had something in her pocket that was interesting, and he was not above investigating this possibility. Maggie stood on her own porch and watched this, and then turned and looked at Arthur, who had stopped at the bottom of the steps and was looking at her with those dark eyes that had not changed in 16 years, still holding that quality between careful attention and genuine feeling that she had noticed in the rain at the graveside, and that had been the first true thing she had known about him. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She smiled at him. "I'm thinking about the umbrella," she said. He smiled back, that full-arrived smile that had come to belong entirely to her in the privacy of their life together. He came up the steps and stood beside her, and they looked out at the Sunday morning town together, at Clara and William Arthur, at the September light on the main street, at the sweep of the Texas plain beyond the last building and the blue sky going all the way to the horizon without obstacle. "Good decision," he said. "The umbrella. The best one you ever made," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the morning went on around them, warm and particular in theirs, and the town of Dust Creek moved through its Sunday with the unhurried ease of a place that had found its shape. And the sky over West Texas was that deep, unblemished Octoberproach blue, and the children were growing and the work was good, and the years ahead were full and open and real. Thomas James called from inside the house about the state of lunch, which was a subject he had strong opinions about from an early age, and Alina Ruth corrected him about something from the same distance with the medical authority of a 12-year-old, who considers herself already qualified, and William Arthur climbed onto Clara's porch railing and had to be retrieved, and the morning was full of all of it, full of noise and love and the ordinary irreplaceable moments that a life is made of. And Maggie Morgan stood on her porch with her husband's arm around her, and her heart as full as she could imagine it being. And she thought about the rain and the grave and the long road between that first morning and this one, and she was grateful, entirely and without complication, for every step of it. The umbrella itself, the large black one that had appeared above her head in the rain without a word, hung in the front hallway of the Morgan house on a hook by the door. It had been there since the first winter she and Arthur shared the house. She had put it there deliberately, and he had noticed and said nothing about it, and she had loved him for that silence, for the understanding in it, for the way he had always known which things needed saying, and which things needed only to be acknowledged and let stand. It was still good against the rain. On wet days it came down from its hook and went out over their heads together, and the rain fell on everything around them and nothing fell on them, and that was, Maggie thought, as good a definition of a marriage as she had ever found. The world with its weather and its difficulty and its unexpected losses and its long gray days falling all around, and two people, side by side under one shelter, keeping each other dry. The years that followed were the years of a life fully lived. Arthur Morgan served as sheriff of Dust Creek until 1904, when Thomas James, who had inherited his father's steadiness and his mother's acuity in equal measure, and had completed 2 years of law study in San Antonio, came home to the town he had grown up in and stood in his father's office and expressed his view that his father had more than earned his rest. Arthur retired the badge with the same quietness with which he had worn it, and Thomas James Morgan became the sheriff of Dust Creek at 20 years old, which the town accepted because they had watched him grow up and knew exactly what they were getting. Alina Ruth had gone to San Antonio at 16 to study, had pressed and argued and written letters, and demonstrated her capability in every possible way until she found a physician who was willing to supervise her training. Because in 1902 there were women practicing medicine in America. Not many, not easily, but they existed, and Alina Ruth Morgan was determined to be one of them. She wrote home every week. Her letters were detailed and funny and full of medical observations, and Maggie read them at the kitchen table and felt the particular pride of watching something you planted grow in a direction you always knew it would take. William Arthur grew up to be a horseman of some talent and a rancher of considerable skill, having inherited the practical intelligence of both his parents, and applied it to the land north of Dusk Creek, where he eventually established himself on a parcel he had worked toward for years, following the same slow and honest path his father had once described to a young woman in a general store in another autumn. Clara Finch lived to 81 years old. She died in 1912 in her own house, in her own bed, with Maggie holding her hand and Arthur in the next room with the children and the grandchildren, and the long human chain of people whose lives she had shaped through the provision of good rooms and honest opinions and suppers at exactly 6. She was buried in the Dust Creek Cemetery, which was the same cemetery where Thomas Lawson lay, and where Walt Briggs lay, and where the town's history was written in stone and kept under the sky. Maggie stood at Clara's grave in the June sun and felt the grief the way she had learned to feel it over the years, fully and without resistance, letting it be what it was. Arthur stood beside her, his hand in hers, and the town of Dusk Creek stood around them in the way that small towns stand around their losses, close and present and not pretending it doesn't matter. After the service, walking home through the summer afternoon with the wildflowers thick in the fields and the blue sky going all the way to the plains, Arthur said, "She was the first person in this town to tell me to stay." Maggie looked at him. "Clara told you to stay. She said it to me directly," he said. "That first month. She said, 'You're going to stay here, Mr. Morgan, because there's a reason you haven't already left, and I suggest you stop pretending you're only passing through.'" He paused. "She was right." Maggie laughed, and it was a full, warm laugh, and the sound of it went out into the summer afternoon and settled there among the flowers and the light. "That sounds exactly like her. She was exactly herself," Arthur said, "every day of her life." "The best thing you can be," Maggie said. He looked at her. "Second best," he said. "The best thing you can be is yourself next to the right person." She stopped walking and looked at him in the summer light, this man she had known for 30 years now, who was silver at the temples and had new lines around his eyes that were the lines of a life lived outdoors and fully, who held her hand with the same care he had always held it, who had held an umbrella over her head in the rain without a word before he had known her name. "Arthur Morgan," she said. "Maggie Morgan," he said. She put her free hand on his chest over his heart and felt it beating steady and real under her palm. "I love you," she said. 30 years of proof, and I still feel it like the first time I said it at that kitchen table." He covered her hand with his. "I love you," he said. "I have since the umbrella." She shook her head, smiling. "You did not love me since the umbrella. You didn't know me." "I knew enough," he said. "A woman who stands in the rain at a grave because she's not ready to walk away yet, that's a woman worth knowing." His thumb moved over her knuckles. "I loved the start of you. The rest only confirmed it." The afternoon light was long and golden on the grass, and the town behind them was going about its afternoon, and ahead of them was the house on the south edge of Main Street, with its wraparound porch, and the umbrella hanging in the hall and the kitchen, where the figures balanced, and the sound of a life that had been built in the particular and unrepeatable way of two people who found each other at the right moment, and held on with everything they had. They walked home in the summer light, side by side, his hand in hers, and the road was familiar beneath their feet, and the sky above was large and blue and full of possibility, and the town of Dusk Creek held them in its story the way places hold the people who have made them what they are, which is to say completely and without condition, and the future was there ahead of them, open and real, waiting to be walked into. And they walked into it. together.